ask your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. White, you did not seek out additional information about the content of the training in Boston in order to compare it with the training that was done for HB 589 or that would be done for SB 824. Is that right?
No, not beyond the description of the training in the paper we were discussing before the break.
And in the Boston election, under the Help America Vote Act, which is sometimes known as HAVA, and state law, voters could have been lawfully required to show their ID under a number of circumstances, including potentially if they were a first-time voter. Is that right?
Yes, a small share of voters could have been asked for ID under the laws you described.
So there would have been conditions under which poll workers would have been expected to ask for identification.
Yes, that's right.
Now, you've just said a small share of voters might have been asked. Did I hear that right?
Yes, that's right.
Now, in 2008, Barack Obama was on the ballot, was he not, for president?
That's my recollection.
And let's publish, if we may, LX 242. It's a Reuters story dated November 8, 2016, entitled More First-Time Voters, Late Deciders. And if we just scroll down a little bit, you can see in the first sentence, Professor, it says some 15% of Americans who cast a ballot on Tuesday said it was their first time voting in a presidential election, according to an early reading from the Reuters Ipsos National Election Day poll, up from 9% of the voters who said so in 2012. Is that right? Do you see that?
I do see that.
And do you have a rough sense as to how many people voted for president in 2016? Was it more than 100 million Americans?
It was many Americans, yes.
But it was more than 100 million Americans, right?
I believe that's correct. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head.
Assuming that's right, then there'd be more than 15 million first-time voters in that election. Is that right?
I believe it would mean that there were more than 15 million voters voting for the first time in a presidential election based on this
presidential. And that's the election that people
participate. I'm sorry. Did you say based on the analysis?
Excuse me, based on this article.
Based on this article. Sorry, you got interrupted. Sorry.
And that's the election that people tend to participate in the most. Is that right?
Yes, presidential elections are high turnout elections.
And those new voters, the millions of new voters in 2008 were disproportionately Black and Hispanic. Is that right?
I believe that's right.
And so the number of first-time voters that were required to show an ID in 2008 were disproportionately Black and Hispanic. Is that right?
Potentially, though I should note that not all first-time voters would be required to show an ID.
Now, the exit poll in the Cobb, Griner, and Quinn study did not explicitly ask the respondent whether he or she was a first-time voter. Is that right?
That's correct, though they did do a number of other things in the paper to try to account for the possibility that there would be this disparity in who could be asked for identification that could potentially drive the disparities that they see in ID requests.
I will ask you about that in just in 1 second, so we'll get to those. At the individual level, however, they were not able to include a variable for whether someone reported falling into one of these groups. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And when a study does not include a variable in the analysis, it's possible that the missing variable is what causes the differences seen in the analysis, correct?
That is possible, though we can often use other information to assess how likely that is.
Well, and here they did two things. First, they did a rough check. Is that right?
Yes, I believe at the polling place level, if I'm remembering correctly.
And you would agree that a rough check is not especially reliable for this purpose because it is subject to an ecological fallacy. Is that right?
I believe that is about how they describe their first approach to this problem, yes.
And the sensitivity analysis that they performed looked at hypothetical differences between the fraction of inactive voters among non-white voters and the fraction of inactive voters among white voters. Is that right?
That's my recollection, though I should specify that they're talking about what they call a group of HAVA/inactive voters, so people who could have been asked for identification under either of those laws. But yes,
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Okay, so just so the record's clear, if you're a first-time voter, then in some circumstances, you'd have to show an ID under HAVA, and likewise, if you're an inactive voter, you might have to show ID. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And it determines, the study does, how big that difference would have to be for the disparity the authors identify to be statistically indistinguishable from zero, right?
That's my recollection.
And when we say statistically indistinguishable from zero, does that mean the same thing as statistically insignificant?
Approximately. My recollection is that they're actually presenting credible intervals here. Essentially, they're doing some Bayesian statistics instead of some frequentist probability stuff. Let us not get into the weeds, but it's approximately that intuition.
Okay. And the study, having identified the differential that would have been necessary between these two groups, the white inactive HAVA voters and the non-white inactive HAVA voters, didn't actually try to figure out whether the two groups met that threshold level, did it?
Well, in that section of the paper, I don't believe they say this is what we think is plausible in terms of this sensitivity analysis and what you, the readers, should thus think. They provide a variety of hypothetical versions of the world, and they tell us how robust their assumptions are to those different possible scenarios in the world. That said, I don't think the paper is completely devoid of information that can help the audience evaluate how likely they think these different scenarios are, given other parts of the paper.
Well, I mean, for example, am I understanding it right that the threshold was 11% in the sense of if there were 100 new white voters and there were 112 new non-white voters, then the phenomenon they've identified would disappear.
That's not my understanding of what that 11% would mean. And my recollection is that it was about 11% that, from my recollection of going through this in the deposition. And what that 11% means here is that if you look at their graphs with the sensitivity analysis, I believe it was at about an 11% difference between, I can't remember whether it was Hispanic and white or Black and white. There are several graphs. It would be an 11% difference between those groups in the rate of being HAVA or inactive voters that would be needed to make their estimates, again, not zero, but statistically indistinguishable from zero. And so what that would mean in practice would be, to take your example of 100 voters, it would mean that if you saw 100 white voters and say 5% of them were HAVA or inactive voters, the share among, I believe it's Black voters, but again, as I noted, I don't recall, the share among 100 Black voters of HAVA inactive voters would need to be something like 16%. That's that 11% difference that we should be picturing.
Thank you. So in that hypothetical,
I'm sorry, you interrupted her again. That's that 11% difference, and I didn't hear the end of your sentence.
That we should be picturing.
I apologize to all. I will try to restrain myself. Okay. Now let's talk about polling place implementation. You remember the chart that your counsel showed to you?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And in your report, you describe various unobserved parts of the North Carolina polling place implementation system that you say lack systematic data. Is that right?
Yes, I believe so.
And although you claim there could be bias at certain points of the implementation, you do not have the evidence that allows you to pin down the exact scale on which bias occurs, correct?
Yes, I think my report is clear about that.
And in your report, you identified 5 decision points where election workers could potentially act in biased ways in implementing SB 824. Is that right?
I believe that's right.
Now let's talk about decision point A, which includes asking certain voters for identification and not others. There's a lack of systematic data by which to judge implementation at that point, correct?
During the March 2016 primary, that's correct.
Okay. And decision point B is when a poll worker finds that a voter does not have acceptable ID at check-in, either turning them away from the polling station with incomplete information or instead directing them to the help station. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I don't observe that systematically across the state.
Okay, just so the record's clear, we don't have systematic data from March 2016 about whether there was bias in decision point B. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, and then decision point C, which is when poll workers address voters who show up without ID at a help station, either telling them about other forms of accepted identification or the opportunity to return later to cure their ballot, right? That's C.
I believe so.
And we don't have systemic data for C either, do we?
Well, I would say we can learn quite a bit about this step from my analysis of the provisional file. Certainly, we can't observe all possible forms that bias at this stage could take, but we can see certain types of problems arising, and we can see the racial composition of voters who have certain types of problems with the provisional ballot process.
Now, I'm going to get to the provisional file in a moment, but you also, for decision point C, relied on 4 affidavits. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
You didn't take any steps to assess the truth or accuracy of these affidavits, did you?
No, I did not.
The affidavits were presented to you by counsel, is that right?
Yes, it is.
And one of those affidavits was from a Ms. Izipke, is that right?
I believe it was Mina Ezekpe, yes.
And were you aware that at the time she tried to vote in March of 2016, she was not a registered voter in the state of North Carolina?
I don't recall whether I saw that at the time that I was reviewing her affidavit.
Do you know that now?
No.
All right, well, let's publish LX 239. This is the deposition of Ms. Izipke, who is one of the 4 affiants on whom you relied. We can see the cover page there, May 29th, 2019, Mina Izipke. And we're going to turn to the bottom of page 34 and the top of page 35. And it says, at that point, when did you register to vote in North Carolina? Answer, I think I ended up registering in September and voted in the general. Question, so you hadn't registered to vote back in March of 2016? Answer, no. Okay, so one of your 4 affiants was not legally entitled to vote, is that right?
I'm not sure I would make that inference from this. I don't recall whether she was trying to vote at a polling place on election day or whether she was trying to arrive at one of the one-stop early voting sites where she could potentially have registered during that period.
You just don't know.
I don't recall.
Okay, well, you say you don't recall. You never even investigated that, right?
I don't recall whether she describes the timing of her attempt to vote in her affidavit.
Okay. Now, assuming she was not legally permitted to vote, then her experience doesn't tell us very much, right?
Well, I guess it depends on the timing, assuming that she was not legally eligible to vote and there was no way that she could have cast a valid ballot at the polling place. I guess I would then wonder why the conversation that she had with the polling place worker indicated to her that she could not vote without certain types of identification. It still strikes me as a problem, even if a voter is not yet registered, if they're being given inaccurate information by poll workers.
Let me ask you, we talked about the fact that there were 2.3 million voters in March of 2016, is that right?
Yes,
And these four affidavits do not constitute a random statistical sample of those voters, correct?
no, they do not.
They are not random because they were provided to you by counsel, correct?
Yes,
And they are not statistically significant because it would take many, many more people to rise to any definition of statistical significance. Is that right?
yes.
Okay. Um, Now, given the large number of people who showed up in March of 2016, it's not surprising to you to discover that some errors were made by poll workers. Is that right?
Yes, that's a possible thing that can happen.
And the affidavits are anecdotal evidence, not systematic data. Is that right?
I think that's a fair characterization.
Now let's talk about decision point D, and we'll get to the provisional file here. When the poll worker fully explains the reasonable impediment report and provides it to the voter, or does not provide it at all, or only with a partial explanation, that's decision point D. Is that right?
That's my recollection.
And the evidence you used in examining the possibility of bias at this point was the four affidavits and the provisional file. Is that right?
Yes,
And the provisional file is a spreadsheet created by the State Board of Elections that includes records for all provisional ballots cast during the 2016 election. Is that right?
that's my understanding.
And it includes a field indicating the reason a voter cast a provisional ballot, as well as a field indicating whether a voter had a reasonable impediment to having photo ID. Is that right?
Yes,
And you would acknowledge there are limits to the sense of scale we can get from the provisional file regarding what behavior occurred. Is that right?
yes, I believe I testified to this during the direct.
Okay. And this provisional file will only allow us to think about certain types of implementation errors. Is that right?
Yes, as I said this morning.
Yeah. And you wouldn't want to claim that the provisional file gives us a full picture of possible implementation errors. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, decision point E is when the poll worker helps the voter fill out the reasonable impediment report successfully. Is that right?
Yes,
And you do not have systemic data for decision point E. Is that right?
no, though again, decision point E could contribute to the patterns of outcomes that we see in the provisional file.
Okay. And you can't give a probability of what we would expect, the likelihood that we would expect to see such biased behavior under SB 824, can you?
No, I'm not sure on what basis I would assign such a probability.
Okay. You've assessed available data on the state's plan for implementing SB 824, is that right?
Yes, it is.
And in your report, you say that there are only, quote, small, close quote, changes between 589 and SB 824, is that right?
It is.
What new IDs were added in SB 824, both initially and as amended?
I described this in my report. Off the top of my head, I can think of things such as certain student identifications, but I don't think I have an exhaustive list to hand.
Do you recall whether government IDs are included? Government employee IDs were added?
I believe so.
And were public assistance IDs added in an amendment?
I believe so. I don't know the timing of when different types of ID were added.
And you haven't tried to measure the impact of these additions on the analysis of the implementation of 589, have you?
I have not done any analysis of the share of North Carolina voters who hold these types of identification.
Okay. And there also in SB 824, what is your understanding of the extent to which, if any, there were changes to the free IDs that are available?
There are changes in the sense that there is a system, a new form of free photo ID to be provided by county boards.
Any other changes you're aware of to free IDs?
I mean, under HB 589, I don't believe that free system that particular form of identification was in place. So that's the main thing that occurs to me.
Okay, were you aware that SB 824 also changed the age for which people could get a free ID from the DMV from 70 to 17?
I believe I had seen that in somewhere in the materials, yes.
Did you try to measure the impact of that change on your analysis?
No, I have not done an analysis of how many voters in North Carolina hold the forms of identification currently accepted under SB 824's requirement.
And you haven't attempted to measure the impact of the change we've just talked about, these new free IDs that will be available on the possibility of implementation errors, correct?
Could you repeat the question?
You have not attempted to measure the impact of these changes to the availability of free IDs on the possibility of implementation errors, have you?
Not except insofar as I note in my report that the kinds of implementation errors that we see at other stages in the process could potentially be inherent in the process of issuing those IDs. But similar to the other forms of IDs we've been discussing, I have not conducted an analysis of how many voters would, for example, be able to access such ID in total.
What is your understanding of how many trips to a county board someone needs to make under SB 824 to get their free ID and vote?
I believe the description of the process is that one should be able to, at the Board of Elections, be immediately provided, or not immediately, be provided with that identification when visiting.
And that's a change too, is that right?
As I said, I believe the entire free ID process at the Board of Elections offices is new.
And that process can be utilized during one-stop voting, is that right? Early voting?
Potentially, depending on where one is early voting.
And that early voting is used disproportionately by African Americans in North Carolina, is that right?
I believe that's right, though I don't know the distribution of African American voters across various one-stop or early voting locations within counties, whether they tend to use the ones that are, for example, at or near the Board of Elections office or other ones throughout counties.
And because you don't have that data, you haven't done any analysis of the impact of this change in the law, correct?
I don't have any sort of statistical analysis to present on this topic, no.
Now, it's true that SB 824 also narrowed the ground on which a reasonable impediment ballot could be challenged. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you've not attempted to measure the impact of this change on the possibility of implementation errors, correct?
I'm not sure quite what your question has in mind about what such an analysis would look like in this case, given that we have not yet seen this particular part of the law.
I'm just
implemented.
asking you if you've done such an analysis. It sounds like the answer is no.
No.
Okay. Now, what is your understanding of the other changes to the reasonable impediment law from HB 589 to SB 824?
In addition to changes in what reasonable impediment declarations are valid or to be accepted, there is a change to the alternative identification part of the reasonable impediment declaration.
And have you studied the impact of that change on your analysis?
I don't know what share of voters are unable to present that alternative identification. No.
These changes from 589 to SB 824 could potentially lessen the probability of discriminatory implementation, correct?
Potentially, though they leave in place many of the decision points that we see in the implementation of HB 589. And to the extent that they introduce changes such as the free ID system, they leave many of those changes in the hands of local actors who will be tasked with implementing them in the same ways that we saw things be implemented under HB 589.
Okay, all things being equal, less discretion means less room for implicit bias. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and so if we look at the reasonable impediment provision, there's less discretion, whereas previously it could be rejected if it made degrading or nonsensical statements. Now it can only be rejected for falsity. Is that right?
That is an accurate characterization of the law's description of the reasonable impediment process. It leaves in place the role of the county board in determining whether reasonable impediment declarations will be accepted. So in that sense, the discretion still lies in the same place, and they will still be tasked with accurately perceiving and then adhering to the state's guidance about that process.
You say it leaves the discretion in the same place, but there's less discretion. Is that right?
Potentially.
Okay, the data, excuse me, in the provisional file, there is not a systemic variable that allows, strike that. There's not a systematic variable that always indicates the reason for which a voter did not fill out a reasonable impediment form. Is that right?
No, the state doesn't appear to have required counties to record affirmatively that they provided accurate information at the polling place.
And the data itself does not supply any explanation for why a voter casting a provisional ballot did not sign a reasonable impediment form. Is that right?
In many cases, that's correct, though I highlight cases in my report where the notes do appear to give a clear indication of why that person did not fill out a reasonable impediment declaration.
And when you say in your report that it seems quite likely that at least some voters were not given adequate information by poll workers, that conclusion is not founded on data in the provisional file, but rather upon the voter surveys that you discuss in your report. Is that right?
If I'm remembering right, yes, I believe I point to analysis in the next section of the report as indicating that it is likely that poll workers could vary in their implementation of policies.
The voter surveys do not ask voters why they did not fill out a reasonable impediment ballot, right?
No, they did not.
And the voter surveys did not even ask voters whether they filled out reasonable impediment reports, correct?
No, this was a nationwide survey taken at a time when even North Carolina didn't have this reasonable impediment process in place.
The provisional file does not allow us to estimate how many people may have been turned away without being offered a provisional ballot or the chance to sign a properly filled out reasonable impediment form. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's how my report describes it.
The provisional file also does not allow us to systematically examine racial disparities in which voters were given incomplete information, correct?
It does not allow us to systematically examine racial disparities in which voters were given incomplete information. Yes, that is how my report describes it.
Regarding the pool of voters whom you characterize as poorly advised due to comments in the provisional file, you said you cannot fully characterize that pool since we don't fully observe that group. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. As I described in my direct testimony, we don't always have information about what happened at the polling place. And so we can't always tell whether misinformation being provided by the poll workers or otherwise problems occurring with the ways poll workers were implementing the policy were the reason that the person's vote did not count.
And just to be clear, you cannot characterize the racial composition of that group, the one that was poorly advised, correct?
Yes, that unobservable group of voters, given the limitations of the state's records, that group of voters who was not given adequate information at the polls, to the extent that we can't observe which voters fall into that group, I can't characterize its racial composition. I can tell you overall about the racial composition of voters who had that set of problems at the polling place or that set of problems with their ballots that we see in the provisional file, people who cast a provisional ballot for reasons of no acceptable ID without an accompanying reasonable impediment declaration and whose vote didn't count for reasons of no ID. But I can't always tell you why, what happened at the polling place to lead that to happen. And so I can't tell you the breakdown of voters who had that specific experience by race.
Now, you did analyze the racial composition of the group of voters with uncounted provisional ballots, but you acknowledge that this group could certainly include individuals who did not file reasonable impediment forms for other reasons than being misinformed by poll workers, correct?
Yes, I do.
In your report, you rely upon the Survey of the Performance of American Elections, SPAE, which asks voters about their experiences at the polling location, correct?
That's correct.
And for the 2016 general election, the survey sample was not large enough to determine whether minority voters were disproportionately likely to encounter poll worker mistakes. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Now let's talk about the possible reasons that a person answering the survey might have reported being asked for identification. One potential hypothesized in your report is that a poll worker erroneously demands identification, correct?
That's correct.
Another potential reason is that a poll worker correctly demands identification under the Help America Vote Act, right?
In some cases, that's possible, depending on the type of identification that we're thinking about.
And you attempted to account for this variable by considering whether the survey respondent reported being a first-time voter. Is that right?
I did include a question for whether the person reported being a first-time voter.
And the survey answer from which you drew that information is the answer to question 3, which asked, was this your first time voting or have you voted in elections before, correct?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
A poll worker might lawfully request identification under HAVA for individuals who have voted in elections before, isn't that right?
Potentially, depending on if they had re-registered somewhere. However,
Yes.
I still don't think this can explain the patterns that we see that I report.
In fact, the lawful request for photo ID under HAVA also includes the circumstance in which a voter registers to vote in a new state, correct?
No, that's not accurate. HAVA doesn't require photo identification, which is why I don't think it can explain the patterns that I describe in my report. It can involve people being required to show identification if, as you say, they've re-registered in a new state. But it can't explain why voters in North Carolina would report showing photo identification at the polls and then report being asked for photo identification. Under HAVA, there's a whole range of identification documents accepted, including, if I'm remembering correctly, it includes things like utility bills.
It includes photos, though, right? Photo
does.
IDs?
It does, but there's no scenario in which poll workers accurately implementing the HAVA requirement would be explicitly asking voters for photo identification.
They might be saying, please give me an ID, and which would include a photo ID, right? They could say that.
They could potentially say that, though the second question that I report using in my report is not whether someone simply says that they showed a photo identification. It's whether they were specifically asked for photo identification. There's a question on the SPAE that's intended to distinguish this distinct possibility, whether someone just showed a photo ID because under an ID request it was convenient, or whether they were explicitly asked for this.
We'll get to that in just one moment. Now, did you have any way to determine whether a survey respondent was voting in North Carolina for the first time?
In North Carolina, as opposed to in their lifetime? No, not from the survey.
Okay, and North Carolina has experiencing net migration to the state over the last 10 years. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And that's why, for example, it's picking up another congressional seat. Is that right?
I believe so.
And does every congressional seat basically amount to 600,000 people or more?
I don't recall the exact the reapportionment numbers.
But it's more than 500,000 people, right?
I would find that plausible, yes.
Yeah. Okay, and so if you pick up another seat, then you're having net migration of at least 50,000 a year. Is that right?
That sounds correct based on the representation you just made.
Okay. And some of these new arrivals may have to show ID, including photo ID. Is that right?
Some of these new arrivals, depending on how they registered in the state, could potentially fall under the requirements of HAVA. There's no, to my understanding of HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, there's no situation in which poll workers would be expected to ask for photo identification from any such subset of voters.
Now, let me ask you about the possibility that a survey respondent may also have reported being asked for ID when the poll worker did not, in fact, demand it. That's a possibility, right?
It's a possibility.
And it could occur because of a misunderstanding between the voter and the poll worker, right?
Possibly, as I note in my report.
And you didn't have any way to try to measure the possibility of that misunderstanding, correct?
Not from this survey, no.
And it's always a possibility that people will misremember their experiences. Is that right?
It's a possibility, though I will note that the SPAE is run immediately after each election to try to minimize the possibility that people will forget what happened at their polling place. And further, I would say it's hard for me to imagine that people would be more likely to remember being asked for ID when that didn't happen, as opposed to forgetting that they showed ID when they did.
Voters could also misrepresent their experiences, correct?
Potentially.
Cobb, Greiner, and Quinn have said in the paper you relied on in your report, if members of some racial ethnic groups here, Blacks and Hispanics, feel defensive about their ability to vote legally, they may over-report being asked for ID. They said that. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's a scenario they explicitly consider in order to do some additional empirical analysis to attempt to rule out this possibility in their data set. Yes.
Another possible reason for the survey respondent giving an incorrect answer is that he or she misunderstood the survey question. Is that right?
That's possible, though I don't think it's likely to explain all of the patterns I describe in my report.
You didn't have any way to measure the possibility of misunderstanding by the survey respondents, correct?
Not of these individual survey respondents, no.
In the 2014 survey, you relied on the answer to question 15, which was, quote, when you first checked in at the polling place to vote, which of the following statements most closely resembles how you were asked to identify yourself? Is that right?
I believe that's right. I would want to look back at the survey documentation to confirm the language.
I'm sorry. We can, I think, pull that up. Let me see. Yes. LX 217, we're going to pull up. This is a questionnaire from YouGov, and it says questionnaire MITU 0019. And then if we go to the second page of this, we can see does this refresh your recollection, Professor?
Yes, this looks familiar.
Okay. And so we can see that first question there. When you first checked in at the polling place to vote, which of the following statements most closely describes how you were asked to identify yourself? And then it goes on to give a multiple choice answer. Let's scroll down a little bit. And those answers were not phrased as I was asked for X or I was asked for Y, but rather I gave X or I gave Y. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so a poll worker says to someone, hypothetically, you're covered by HAVA. I need a form of ID, including a utility bill. And then the person says, okay, here's a photo ID. That they weren't asked for the ID under 15, but the answer would be, I gave my ID. Isn't that right?
Depending on how confused voters were when reading this survey, I guess it is theoretically possible that in response to this question, that scenario you just described could happen. Though, as I noted a few minutes ago, the SPAE also includes an additional follow-up question for people who report showing photo identification, asking explicitly, again, whether they were asked for photo identification and whether that's the reason that they showed it. So to the extent that voters were confused by this question, that would be clarified by the following question.
It's not confusion. In the hypothetical I just gave you, someone's asked, please identify yourself through a utility bill or photo or other HAVA compliant ID. And then they come back and they answer, I gave my ID. How is that confusion?
Well, because the bolded text in the question above says how you were asked. So I would interpret that as a question about how they were asked to identify themselves.
You would not offer an opinion about how commonly a voter could be confused by this question, would you?
I don't think I have a way to evaluate that, no.
The upshot of this is that there are potentially many other explanations for the disparity you found in the 2014 election other than biased behavior by poll workers. Isn't that right?
I wouldn't say that, both because of some of the conversations we've just had around, for example, the limitations of an explanation based on the Help America Vote Act, but also because, and actually because the language of the SPAE is, I would say, well, let me start the sentence again. I would say that the SPAE is not the only source of information we have on voters' experiences at the polls. And the patterns that we see of poll workers inaccurately applying voter identification requirements have not been observed only in this particular survey with this particular question wording. We observe it also in, as you noted a few minutes ago, differently worded exit polls run by a different team in a different format, We also observe similar patterns in papers that do monitoring of polling places, that watch what happens in polling places and observe problems of voter ID implementation and variability in how poll workers implement them, which doesn't involve asking voters about their experiences at all. So it's certainly possible that there are some alternative explanations for certain responses in this survey, but I would note that the things that we see in the SPAE, both my analysis of North Carolina's data specifically and the broader national results reported by the research team that ran the survey, are consistent with a range of other forms of data.
You would agree that biased behavior by poll workers is not the only possible explanation for the disparities that you discuss in your report in paragraph 60, right?
Sorry, I don't remember what paragraph 60 is. Should I
Okay.
refer to a hard copy of my report?
Sure, please. And we'll put it on the screen, Professor. So this is, with the court's permission, we'll publish JX 692. This has been admitted into evidence and is Professor White's report. And we're going to go to paragraph 60 on page 27. Can you see that, Professor? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'll give you a moment to refresh your recollection.
Thank you. What was your question?
Sure. So you would agree that the biased behavior by poll workers is not the only possible explanation for the disparities that you discuss in paragraph 60 of your report. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. There are a range of possible things that could happen. It could be, for example, that poll workers in different areas with different racial compositions are more likely to misunderstand requirements such that they misapply them, rather than individual poll workers treating voters differently across race. They could make mistakes at different rates in different neighborhoods. I guess what I have just described would still be consistent with members of racial minorities being disproportionately impacted by such mistakes, but they wouldn't be evidence of individual level bias on the part of poll workers.
Now let's talk about the disparity you found. You would agree there is always the risk that the set of people who answer a survey is not fully or perfectly representative of the population that we seek to use it to generalize to, correct?
Yes, that's a possibility with survey research.
And with respect to the survey we've just been looking at, they sought to correct that measuring error by adding survey weights intended to make the survey even more similar to the North Carolina electorate. Is that right?
Yes, they created survey weights to make the sample, which was already quite similar on many dimensions to the registered voter population of North Carolina.
What is a
Even
survey?
more similar.
Sorry.
To make that sample, which was already on many dimensions quite representative of the registered voter population of North Carolina, to make it even more similar to that population.
What is a survey weight?
It is a weight that is used to weight analyses of survey data, to slightly upweight or downweight individual respondents to a survey to make sure that the overall population being used to estimate is as similar as possible to the population of interest out in the world.
One way in which the pool of survey respondents may have differed from the North Carolina electorate is that they had a higher rate of voting in person. Is that right?
As opposed to not voting, for example?
As opposed to voting absentee.
I don't recall what the composition of in-person relative to absentee voting is in this population.
And you didn't consider whether that disparity created issues with using this survey, correct?
No, it's certainly common for surveys of voters to to have a hard time finding voters who don't vote, for example, which is, I think, one distinction between this sample and the general registered voter population that explains some of the disparity you were just describing around in-person voters. It's fairly common in surveys about elections. When you ask people to take a survey about elections, the people who are willing to take a survey about elections tend to be a little more into elections than the general population. And so it's hard to use these surveys sometimes to characterize things like the rate of people who don't vote, for example, or their opinions or their experiences. But in this case, that kind of difference, it's hard for me to picture a story in which those kinds of differences would bias the inferences that I'm making about in-person voters' experiences specifically. To the extent that people are a little more interested in voting and a little more prone then to have voted, for example, it's not clear to me that those people should be especially likely to do things like have been asked for identification at the polls.
Isn't the racial composition of those who vote absentee different than the racial composition of those who vote in person in North Carolina?
I don't recall the exact racial composition of absentee voters during the 2016 election.
Do you have a general ballpark sense of it in North Carolina?
Yes, I believe it is somewhat different.
Okay. You state that the 2016 sample is not large enough to look at the effects by race. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Do you recall what the racial breakdown of the non-first-time voters who were asked for photo ID was?
Not of the non-first-time voters who were asked for photo ID. No, the overall sample is relatively similar to the racial composition of the registered voter population of the state, but I didn't look at this for that specific subgroup.
And you did not report that breakdown because you wouldn't seek to make generalizations about the experience of non-white voters from a relatively small set of people, given the size of the overall state sampling in 2016. Is that right?
Yes, I wouldn't seek to make estimates for specific racial groups in the population from that data.
All right. In reporting the results from the 2014 survey in your expert report, did you rely on the weighted or the unweighted numbers?
I relied on analysis using the included survey weights.
And I apologize if I'm just not following you technically, but so was that weighted or unweighted?
Weighted.
Okay. Do you recall whether the racial makeup of the 2014 survey respondents resembled the racial makeup of the broader electorate?
Yes, it did.
Do you recall, let me skip over here and see, and talk to you a little bit about your rebuttal report. In your rebuttal report, you criticized the state for not taking steps to assess the efficacy of its education and training initiatives. Is that right?
Do you have a particular portion of the report in mind?
Well, let me ask you, have you offered any criticism of the education and training materials offered by the state in connection with 589?
I have described my concerns about specific practices within the education and training processes, yes.
Okay, but I mean, did you look at the actual training video, for example?
I believe I looked at stills from the video. I don't know that I watched all of the training materials produced by the state, no.
Did you read the transcript of them?
I don't recall.
Okay. Do you recall whether you had the transcript of them?
At this moment, no, I don't recall.
Okay. You also mentioned a state survey of county board of elections offices concerning the free IDs available under SB 824, which revealed variations in the office's facility with the machines and in their understanding of when to provide free IDs. Do you recall that?
I do.
And you would agree that there's some level of unfamiliarity and confusion that we can expect when a new process is being rolled out. Isn't that right?
Potentially.
And wouldn't you expect that county workers to become less error prone and less confused the more they issue these IDs?
I have no way to assess how skilled they might become in the future without knowing what kinds of feedback or additional training they would have.
So your expert opinion is even if they, let's say they get no more training, no more feedback, don't you think they'll get better at doing their job just by repeating it and getting more familiar with it over time?
I don't know whether that's the case without knowing where they are at baseline right now.
You also mentioned that the State Board of Elections intervened after observing counties having trouble producing IDs. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You believe that regarding this particular set of problems, the state took action. Is that right?
With respect to this particular set of problems, yes.
So this suggests that the state board is monitoring the efficacy of local implementation, correct?
In this particular realm, it appears that they have taken action to do some monitoring, yes.
And the state board is taking steps to redress disparities. Is that right?
My understanding is that they are taking steps to change some county practices, yes.
You address in your rebuttal report voter confidence, but you've never published on voter confidence, have you?
That's correct.
And you believe that all things being equal, more voter confidence is better than less voter confidence. Is that right?
All else equal, yes.
Okay, you testified earlier that voter fraud is pretty rare. Is that right?
Yes.
Were you aware that according to the plaintiff's expert in this very case, there were over 400 felons that voted in one election in North Carolina?
I believe I have seen a table of cases of potential voting by people with felony convictions referred to prosecution.
And are you aware of the fact that that 400 person number of felons would be more than enough to sway the most recent Chief Justice race in the state of North Carolina?
I don't know that I have seen a comparison of the case in which that number of people with felony convictions were found to actually have cast ballots in an election where that number of people could have swayed the election. I'm not aware of that.
Right. Did the academic literature affirmatively conclude that voter fraud is not widespread? Or rather, did it conclude that there is not evidence that voter fraud is widespread?
Well, it's always hard to prove a negative, but the academic literature does include a number of attempts to exhaustively search for and catalog cases of voter fraud. And there have also been some efforts to affirmatively measure how frequently it occurs, such as via survey experimental efforts.
Let me stop you right there. It's now very close to 1 o'clock, and we're going to go ahead and stop the testimony for the day right there. When we stop for today, we are going to go into breakout sessions very briefly. Are there any matters that you all need to put on the record before we recess for the weekend? I will tell you that on Monday morning, we'll start at 9:30 a.m. And that will be our schedule Monday through Thursday of next week. And then Friday, our schedule again would be 9 until 1. I don't know, Ms. Riggs, I think you had mentioned something about Professor White not being available on Monday.
Yes, John. Oh, sorry.
Do you want to be heard about that?
Yes, Your Honor, she isn't available on Monday. We've already sent an email to defendants and are trying to figure out when we can get her back, and they've agreed to work with us on that, I think.
Yes, Your Honor, we're happy to conclude this examination at whatever time is convenient for Professor White and the court.
Okay. Mr. Cox, do you have any objection to starting with another witness on Monday morning?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, so what I don't necessarily need to know right now, Ms. Riggs, what witness you'll call on Monday morning, but if Professor White is not available then go ahead and have another witness lined up for Monday at 9:30. And then assuming that over the weekend you'll get with her about when she can come back and be a part of it again, finish the testimony. So as long as you all agree to that, sounds fine to the court. Are there any other matters that we need to take up?
Not for the legislative defendants, Your Honors.
Not for
Okay.
plaintiffs.
All right. Well, it's been a long week, and it's been a productive week. Perhaps not gotten as far as we would like, but I think that all things considered, things are going fairly smoothly. The technical difficulties we've been able to work through. So I'm personally pleased with the way things have gone. I do extend to you all. Hope you have a great weekend, relaxing and refreshing weekend, particularly the refreshing part. And we'll see you back here on Monday morning at 9:30 a.m. Monday at 9:30. All right.
Thank you, Your Honors.
All right. So we'll go into recess at this point, and I'll just ask one of the hosts to launch the